Maya stood at the threshold of her new apartment, the door slightly ajar as the evening sun bathed the room in a soft, golden light. It was a small space, nothing grand or extravagant like the mansion she had once called home. But it was hers. It was the first time in years that she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. She let the silence wrap around her, the hum of the city outside a distant reminder of everything she had left behind. Her fingers grazed the edge of the counter, the coolness of the marble soothing in the stillness. A deep breath filled her lungs, the air different here, fresher, lighter. She had spent so much of her life suffocating beneath expectations, living in the shadow of someone else's dreams. But now, for the first time in a long while, Maya felt a sense of peace. She had finally taken control of her life. As she sank onto the worn couch, she couldn't help but think about the life she had once shared with Victor, the man who had promised her everything and yet had given her nothing that truly mattered. The gifts, the cars, the fancy vacations, they had all been his way of showing love. But Maya had come to realize that love was never in the things he bought, never in the luxuries he provided. It was in the quiet moments, the late-night conversations, the gestures that spoke louder than money ever could. Victor had never understood that. Maya had spent years yearning for his attention, his affection, always hoping that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally see her. But as time passed, she realized that no matter how much she sacrificed, no matter how much she tried to fit into a life that wasn't hers, she would never be enough for him. Not because she wasn't worthy, but because he was too lost in his world to even notice the woman standing right in front of him. The sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance, but Maya didn't flinch. She had long since stopped waiting for his calls, his apologies, or the hollow promises that never came to fruition. But then, just when she thought she was free, when she thought she had moved on from the pain, she received a call that would change everything. Miss Grant. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, crisp and professional. This is from Victor Grant. There's a delivery for you. A part of her wanted to laugh, a bitter chuckle escaping her lips. A delivery. As if another expensive car or designer watch would fill the empty spaces in her heart. But it wasn't just any delivery. It was a Rolls-Royce, his Rolls-Royce. Her breath caught in her chest as the weight of it sank in. She didn't know whether to feel anger or sadness. But one thing was certain. Victor's love, however misplaced, had never been about her. It was always about possession. It was always about control. And now she had to decide whether to accept his final attempt to buy her back, or whether to let go once and for all. Maya's fingers clutched the brochure with a desperation she couldn't quite explain. As the door of the dealership swung shut behind her, the cool air outside hit her face, grounding her back to reality. She stood there for a moment, frozen. The world seemed louder now, more intimidating, as if the luxury cars inside were mocking her for ever believing she could be part of that world. She looked around the parking lot, her eyes skimming over the nondescript cars. It all felt so trivial now. She thought about the long hours she had spent, wiping down tables, serving customers who barely noticed her. Each night after the cafe closed, she would walk home, dreaming of this very moment. Of walking into a dealership, not with embarrassment but with pride, ready to pick out a car that would represent everything she worked for, everything she had fought to be. But today those dreams had been shattered. A wave of humiliation washed over her, her heart sinking lower and lower. She had imagined this moment so many times, playing out her success in her head. But it wasn't supposed to end like this. She wasn't supposed to be rejected. Not after everything she'd sacrificed. Not after all the late nights and all the empty promises she had whispered to herself, telling herself that one day, it would all be worth it. Maya stood in the parking lot, her vision blurry. She could feel the sting of the salesman's words. His tone, polite, yes, but that sharpness in the air when he told her to go somewhere more suited to her budget, had cut through her like a knife. He didn't see her. No, she wasn't just a woman standing in front of him. She was invisible. A shadow. A nobody in a world where only the privileged thrived. She had known that this was a world where people were measured by their wealth, by their appearance, by their brand, but she hadn't thought it would be so glaring. It was more than just the rejection. It was the realization that the line she had always known existed between the haves and the have-nots wasn't a distant concept. It was something real. Something tangible. Something that she was constantly reminded of. Maya took a deep breath and wiped away the tear that had escaped her eye. She didn't want to cry. She wasn't going to let this defeat her, not completely. She still had her pride. But what had hurt the most was how little she had been seen for who she was. Not a customer. Not someone with dreams and aspirations, but just another person who didn't belong. She turned away from the dealership, but something in her broke. She had come there for validation. She had hoped that, for once, she would be acknowledged. That the world would finally say, "You matter." But instead she had been dismissed like a nuisance. Like someone who didn't deserve to even look at a Mercedes. Maya walked toward the bus stop, but her steps felt heavier with each passing moment. Her heart was dragging her down like an anchor, and with every step, the weight of her failure felt heavier. How had she let herself get this far? How had she allowed herself to believe she could step into a world that wasn't meant for her? As she boarded the bus, the faces around her were a blur. People lost in their phones, their lives, while she sat in silence, drowning in her thoughts. She kept replaying the moments that led up to her rejection, wondering if there had been anything she could have done differently. If there was something in her appearance, in the way she spoke, that made the salesman look at her like she wasn't worthy of his time. The world she had always dreamed of, the one she thought she could break into, seemed to get farther and farther away with each passing second. The sadness settled in deeper, and with it, a new question lingered. What was the point of dreaming when the world was determined to keep you out? When she arrived at her apartment, the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon from the bakery downstairs greeted her. But the comfort of the place she had always called home felt distant now. She walked past the small kitchen, where an old teapot whistled on the stove, but it didn't feel like hers anymore. It felt like a prison. She had grown so tired of the same routine, the endless cycle of work, of serving others, of going unnoticed. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Victor, her husband. "I'll be home late. Need anything?" She stared at the message, reading it over and over again. The man she married, the billionaire who seemed to have everything, had never quite understood the weight of her dreams. He lived in a world that didn't touch the people she interacted with daily. She envied him, yet part of her resented him for it. He had never asked her how her day went. He didn't notice the exhaustion in her voice, nor the way she carried the burden of her unspoken desires. He had always been there, but not really there, as if their marriage was a transaction. Comfortable, yes, but emotionally distant. Maya sat down on the couch, staring out the window at the city skyline. The glittering lights of the towering buildings mocked her. They were so far out of her reach. She closed her eyes, feeling the overwhelming exhaustion seep into her bones. "Why is this so hard?" she whispered to the empty room. She had spent years building a life for herself, a life that was supposed to be her own, filled with the promise of independence. But everything she wanted felt like it was locked behind doors she couldn't open. The life she had fought for felt like a fragile illusion, and today the illusion had cracked wide open. Her hands shook as she placed the car brochure on the coffee table. She had imagined so many things in her mind. A beautiful car, a life of luxury, of freedom. But as she ran her fingers over the paper, she realized that none of it was real. It had been a fantasy, a fleeting thought. And now it felt stupid. How could she ever think she belonged there? Suddenly the phone buzzed again. Another message from Victor. "Let's take a trip soon, all right? You, me, and maybe a getaway car. Something small. Let me know what you want." Maya stared at the message. A getaway car, he called it. As if it didn't matter to him. As if they could just hop into a car and drive away without a care in the world. She imagined the luxury cars they could drive, the ones that would make her feel like she finally belonged. But in reality, those cars weren't meant for her. They were meant for people like him. People who had the world at their fingertips. Not for women like her. Victor didn't even understand. He never would. Maya felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions swirling. But no tears came. She was tired of crying. Tired of wishing for things that were never meant to be. And for the first time she felt the full weight of her own smallness. As she lay down on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling, a new thought began to emerge, something darker. Maybe it wasn't just about the car. Maybe it wasn't about any material thing at all. Maybe she had been chasing a fantasy for so long that she had forgotten what really mattered. And in that silence, in the heartache of rejection, Maya realized one undeniable truth. No matter how many luxury cars she drove, no matter how many mansions she lived in, none of it would ever fill the emptiness she felt inside. The dream had burned brightly once, but now it was nothing more than ashes in her hand. The next morning, Maya woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. She could hear the distant hum of traffic and the soft murmur of the city waking up around her. But in her apartment, everything felt still. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a feeling of heaviness pressing down on her chest. The rejection from the dealership the day before had carved a hollow space in her heart. It wasn't just about the car, it was about how little she mattered in a world that prided itself on appearances and wealth. Her mind wandered back to the night before, to the conversation with Victor. The man she married, the man who built empires and shattered industries, had never understood the kind of yearning that burned in her heart. She wasn't like him. She didn't live in a world where money opened doors effortlessly. She wasn't born into privilege. No, she had fought for everything she had, scrimping and saving, working late nights just to pay her bills. She had always felt like she was climbing a mountain that never seemed to get any smaller. She sighed and rolled out of bed, her muscles stiff from the exhaustion of the day before. The silence of the apartment felt suffocating. The walls, once a comforting embrace, now felt like they were closing in on her. The emptiness of her life seemed to stretch out before her, a cavernous void she wasn't sure how to fill. Maya wandered into the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. She moved mechanically, going through the motions of making a cup of coffee, but her thoughts were elsewhere. As the steam rose from the cup, she watched it curl in the air, like a wisp of her fading dreams. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the counter, and she wondered if she had been wrong to believe in any of it. The car. The life of luxury. The idea that she could belong in a world that didn't have a place for people like her. She grabbed her phone and for a moment considered texting Victor. She thought about asking him about the message he had sent the night before, the one about a getaway car. But she quickly dismissed the thought. Victor didn't know her, not really. He didn't understand what it was like to struggle. He had been born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and though she loved him once, at least she thought she did, she realized now that their worlds were too far apart. The man she married had long since stopped seeing her. She was just an ornament in his life, someone to flaunt at charity galas and public events, but never someone he truly cared to know. The phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the screen. It was a message from Victor. I'll be home late tonight. There's a meeting I can't miss. Let's talk about the weekend getaway when I get back. Maya stared at the message, the words twisting in her stomach. The weekend getaway. It seemed so trivial, so detached from everything she was feeling. A weekend getaway in a world she didn't feel like she belonged to. He spoke of luxury as if it were just a casual part of life. But for her, everything had come with a price. Sweat, tears, and unspoken sacrifices. She wanted to respond. She wanted to tell him how she felt, how her heart ached with loneliness. She wanted to tell him that the luxury cars, the mansion, the private jets, none of it meant anything if she was left behind, lost in the shadows. But she couldn't. She knew that Victor wouldn't understand. He never had. Instead, she dropped the phone back onto the counter and took a sip of her coffee. The bitterness of it mirrored the emptiness inside her. She had spent so much time building a life for herself, one that was supposed to make her feel like she was enough. But now all of it felt hollow. The cafe job, the apartment, even her relationship with Victor. She had convinced herself that she was chasing her dreams, but now she wondered if she was only running from a truth she wasn't ready to face. Maya spent the morning lost in thought, her mind heavy with unanswered questions. She didn't know what she was searching for, something tangible, something real, something that would fill the hole she felt inside. But no matter how hard she tried to look, nothing seemed to make sense. Around noon she decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her head, to breathe in something other than the suffocating air of her apartment. She pulled on a jacket and left without saying a word to anyone. The cool breeze greeted her as she stepped outside, but it did little to ease the weight on her shoulders. She wandered aimlessly through the streets of the city, the rain having slowed to a soft drizzle. People rushed by, oblivious to her, lost in their own worlds. Maya couldn't help but feel like a ghost among them. She wasn't a part of this city. Not really. Not the way she had hoped. She had always dreamed of fitting in, of being someone who mattered. But the harder she tried, the more she felt like an outsider. As she walked, she found herself in front of a small park. She paused, gazing at the bench where she and Victor had sat years ago when they first met. She had been so naive back then, so in love with the idea of a perfect future. The memory of that day hit her with a sharp pang. She remembered the way Victor had looked at her then, his eyes full of possibility. They had been so different, so full of hope. But somewhere along the way they had lost that spark. Maya sat down on the bench, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. She closed her eyes and let the soft sound of the rain soothe her for a moment. But as her mind wandered, the same painful realization began to creep in again. She had settled for a life that didn't truly make her happy. She had married Victor out of love, yes, but also out of a desire for stability. A desire to belong. But the love they once shared had faded into something distant, something hollow. Victor was distant now, caught up in his work, his wealth, his empire. He didn't see her anymore. He didn't see the woman she was. The woman who longed for more than just luxury, who wanted real connection, real companionship. Maya had tried so hard to build a life that would make her feel validated, but all she had done was trap herself in a gilded cage. Her eyes opened and she stared at the wet pavement in front of her, her thoughts swirling. Maybe she had been wrong to think that success meant anything without love. Without meaning. She had chased the dream of a perfect life for so long, but now she realized that what she truly wanted wasn't a car or a mansion. It wasn't the superficial things that Victor had given her, it was something deeper, something real. She wanted to feel seen. She wanted to feel like she mattered. She stood up from the bench, her heart heavy but resolute. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low in the sky. Maybe it was time for her to stop chasing a dream that wasn't hers to begin with. Maybe it was time to stop living in the shadows. As she walked back toward her apartment, a sense of clarity washed over her. She didn't need the approval of the dealership or the recognition of her husband. She needed to reclaim herself, her worth, her dreams, her identity. No longer would she let the world define her by what she had or didn't have. The city around her seemed a little smaller now, a little less intimidating. She wasn't invisible. Not anymore. Maya spent the next few days in a haze of reflection. The rainy afternoon at the park had sparked something within her, a quiet determination that she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she had a sense of clarity. She wasn't going to let the shadows of rejection or loneliness control her anymore. The truth was, she had spent so much of her life trying to fit into a mold that wasn't hers. It was time to break free, to carve out a space where she could be herself, without the need for validation from anyone else. But that didn't mean she had all the answers. In fact, she felt more lost than ever. She had spent so many years following the expectations of others, of her family, of society, of Victor, that now, when she was finally ready to make her own decisions, the path ahead seemed overwhelming. It had been 4 days since the incident at the dealership, and Maya's phone had remained silent. She hadn't heard from Victor except for the occasional business-related text. She'd grown used to his absences, both physical and emotional, but something about the silence now felt different. The distance between them had always existed, but it had never been so palpable. Maya didn't want to wait for Victor to change, to magically start paying attention to her in the way she needed. She needed to take control of her own life. And the first step, she realized, was to finally confront him. The nagging feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than just their misaligned schedules, was gnawing at her. It was time to confront the truth. That evening, when Victor returned home, the house was quiet, and the air felt thick with the weight of unspoken words. He walked in, his tailored suit still immaculate despite the long hours of work. Maya noticed, as she always did, how effortlessly he moved through life, while she struggled just to find balance in her own. Victor placed his briefcase down on the kitchen counter and glanced at her, his eyes tired but indifferent. "Hi," he said, his voice as distant as ever. Maya didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, her mind gathering the courage to say what she had been avoiding for months, maybe even years. She had spent so much time in the background of their relationship, supporting him, enabling his success, but now it was time for her to be seen. "Victor, we need to talk," Maya said, her voice steady but laced with the weight of her emotions. Victor looked at her for a moment, his eyebrows furrowing. "About what?" She stood up from the kitchen table and walked toward him, her heart beating faster with each step. This wasn't going to be easy. It was never easy to confront someone you loved, especially when you weren't sure if they still loved you back. "I don't know what we're doing anymore," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "You're always gone, and when you're here it's like you're not really here. I've been trying to keep up, trying to fit into a life that doesn't feel like mine. And Maya stopped herself. She couldn't let the emotion spill out too quickly. She needed to make him see, needed him to understand. She needed to tell him how suffocated she felt, how invisible she had become in her own marriage. Victor sighed and rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted from the demands of the day. "Maya, I don't have time for this right now. I'm barely keeping things together at work, and you know that. I told you we'd take a trip, but you just have to be patient. I'm doing this for us, for our future." His words stung, not because they were untrue but because they were always the same. They were the same words he had said for the past few years, every time she tried to connect with him. For us, for our future. But the truth was there was no us anymore, not really. She was just a passive participant in a life she had never fully chosen for herself. "You're not here anymore, Victor," she said, her voice trembling with the rawness of her words. "And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm drowning in this emptiness. I don't want to keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." Victor's expression faltered for a moment, and Maya thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps? Or was it simply the weariness of a man who had spent too long avoiding the things that mattered? He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you want from me, Maya. You have everything. You have the house, the lifestyle. What more could you possibly want?" Her heart sank. That was it, wasn't it? That was how he saw her. He thought that all she needed were material things. The cars. The house. The things he thought she wanted. But what she really wanted, what she had always wanted, was his attention, his love, his presence. She wanted a partnership, not a life filled with opulence and silence. "I want you, Victor," she whispered. "I don't want your money. I don't want a mansion. I just want to matter to you." There was a long silence between them, thick with the weight of her words. Victor stared at her, his face unreadable. She could see him processing what she had said, but there was no immediate response. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Maya didn't wait for him. She had waited long enough. She turned away, her heart aching with the realization that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop waiting for someone who would never come back to her. "Maybe we need some time apart," she said, her voice barely audible as she walked toward the door. "I need to figure out who I am without you. Without this life you've given me." Victor didn't stop her. He didn't call out her name. He didn't try to hold her back. He simply stood there, motionless, as she walked out of the room. Maya stepped out into the night air, her breath shaky but her resolve stronger than it had ever been. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer going to hide behind a facade. She was going to live for herself, even if that meant facing the unknown. As she walked into the cool night, Maya felt the weight of her past start to lift, piece by piece. She wasn't the woman who had walked into that dealership days ago, hoping for validation from a world that had never cared about her. She was someone new, someone ready to face the future, whatever it held. The next few days passed in a blur. Maya had moved into a small, temporary apartment, one that didn't have the elegance or size of the house she had shared with Victor, but it was hers. The apartment was quiet, filled with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic passing by. She spent her days working at the cafe, taking on extra shifts to cover the rent and buy herself the simple comforts she had missed: fresh flowers, a good bottle of wine, and her own space to breathe. Victor hadn't reached out after their conversation. She hadn't expected him to, not right away. He was the type of man who preferred silence over confrontation, avoidance over resolution. The distance between them had stretched so far that it felt impossible to bridge. Maya wasn't sure where they went from here. The man she married had become a stranger to her. A man who thought that love could be bought with luxury cars and fancy vacations, but never with time or care. And she wasn't willing to settle for that any longer. It was a Wednesday when the unexpected happened. Maya was in her new apartment, sitting at the small kitchen table, working on a crossword puzzle to pass the time between her shifts. The morning had been slow, and the buzz of the city outside was calming for once. She sipped her coffee, feeling more centered than she had in a long time. She was starting to find a rhythm in her new life. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was enough. The doorbell rang. At first she thought it was just a delivery, maybe her groceries or a package she had ordered. She rose slowly, stretching her legs, and made her way to the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Not Victor. Not anyone from her old life. Her hand paused on the doorknob as a strange, unfamiliar feeling washed over her. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a sudden weight in her chest. When she opened the door, she was met with a sight that took her breath away. A tall man stood on the other side, holding a clipboard and looking at her with a polite, professional smile. But behind him, gleaming under the morning sunlight, was a car. The car. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, its black and silver frame so polished that it looked like it had just been driven out of a showroom. The sight of it left her momentarily speechless. "I have a delivery for you, Miss Grant," the man said, his voice calm and unruffled. "May I come in?" Maya blinked, her pulse quickening. "A delivery?" she echoed, her voice a little shaky. "I didn't order anything." He glanced down at his clipboard. "According to my instructions, this Rolls-Royce is meant for you. Would you like to take a look?" Maya stood frozen, her eyes locked on the car, her mind racing. She felt like she was caught in some kind of dream. She had always imagined owning a luxury car, dreamed of the day she would be able to step into one and make it her own. But never in a million years did she think it would be delivered to her apartment, unannounced, under these circumstances. Who sent it?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled briefly, as if he had been expecting the question. "It's from Mr. Victor Grant," he said, the name hanging in the air between them. "He arranged for this delivery to your address. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" Maya stood there in stunned silence, her mind racing. A Rolls-Royce. From Victor. He had sent this to her, an extravagant, expensive gesture to make up for everything that had gone wrong between them? Or was this simply another attempt to buy her silence, to placate her with more material things, when what she truly needed was his presence, his love, his honesty? She couldn't move. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell the man to take the car back. To tell him that she didn't need this, that she didn't want it. But the truth was, a part of her was mesmerized by the idea of the car, by the luxury and the freedom it promised. But another part of her recoiled at the thought of using it as a symbol of the hollow life she had once tried to build with Victor. The man cleared his throat, breaking her thoughts. "I'll leave you to it, Miss Grant. If you decide to keep it, just sign here." He handed her a pen and the clipboard, but Maya barely noticed it. She was too lost in the world of contradictions that this car represented. The thought of taking the Rolls-Royce felt like a betrayal to everything she had just learned about herself. She didn't need another symbol of wealth or luxury to define her. She didn't need to play the role of the perfect, pampered wife anymore. She needed to define herself on her own terms, not by the car she drove or the designer labels she wore. But there was something else, something deeper, that tugged at her. The car was an extravagant gift. It was Victor's attempt at apologizing, or perhaps, just another way for him to think that material things could make up for the distance that had grown between them. She knew deep down that he couldn't understand what she needed, what she truly wanted. She could never be satisfied by things, no matter how much they glittered. Taking a deep breath, Maya made her decision. She looked up at the delivery man, still waiting patiently by the door. "I'm sorry, but I'm not accepting the car," she said, her voice firm. "Please take it back." The man nodded, unfazed by her refusal. "Understood, Miss Grant. I'll inform Mr. Grant." He turned and walked back to the car, climbing into the driver's seat and slowly pulling away. Maya stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the car disappear down the street. The sun was still shining, but the weight in her chest had lifted. She had made a choice that felt right for her, even if it went against everything that had once seemed important. The car, the lavish gestures, none of it mattered anymore. She was free. As the sound of the Rolls-Royce faded into the distance, Maya turned back into her apartment, closing the door behind her. She had taken the first real step toward living life on her own terms. She didn't need Victor's extravagant gifts or his empty promises. What she needed was to rediscover who she was, outside of the shadows of her marriage, and to live a life that was truly hers. The days following the Rolls-Royce incident were transformative for Maya. The apartment she had once found lonely now felt like a sanctuary. There were no more grand gestures from Victor, no more surprises that only served to remind her of the distance that had grown between them. She didn't miss the luxurious, sterile life she'd lived before. What she missed, what she longed for, was the warmth of real connection. Something she had been chasing all her life, yet had always eluded her. She didn't immediately cut ties with Victor. There were still moments of weakness, of longing for the comfort of the life they had built together, even if it was a life built on a shaky foundation. But Maya knew she was no longer the same woman who had walked into that dealership a week ago, full of insecurity and desperate for approval. She had found her voice, and more importantly, she had found the courage to stand up for herself. Victor didn't call, didn't even try to text her, not after the car incident. The silence was deafening, but in a way, it also made her feel free. Free from the expectations he had placed on her, free from the weight of trying to fit into a world that wasn't hers. The more time passed, the clearer it became. Their relationship had been built on superficial things. Victor had never truly understood her, and she had never fully understood him. The first week in her new life was like learning to breathe again. Maya spent time reconnecting with her old friends, people who had always known her as she was, without the gloss of wealth or status. She was reminded of the simple pleasures of life that had once made her feel alive. The smell of fresh coffee brewing in the morning, the sound of laughter shared over dinner, the quiet satisfaction of finishing a book she had been meaning to read. She began to rediscover parts of herself she had forgotten. The woman who didn't need a title, a car, or a mansion to feel important. It was on a crisp Saturday afternoon when everything shifted. Maya was at the cafe, pouring coffee into a mug, her hands moving with practiced ease. It had been a slow day, and the hours stretched in front of her like endless road. As she wiped down the counter, she heard the faintest sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see a regular customer, but instead, she found herself face to face with someone she hadn't seen in days. Victor. His presence filled the space as it always had, but now it felt different. He was standing in front of her in a well-tailored suit, his hair neatly combed, but there was something in his eyes that caught her attention. His expression was no longer one of aloofness or arrogance. There was something else, a vulnerability Maya hadn't seen in him before. For the first time, he looked like a man who wasn't entirely sure of himself. "Hi," Victor said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. He cleared his throat. "Can we talk?" Maya's heart raced, but she didn't let herself show it. She had long been accustomed to the idea of him coming and going, but something about this moment felt different. There was no grand gesture, no lavish apology. Just the rawness of two people standing in front of each other, unsure of what to say but knowing that something had to change. "I don't think we have much to talk about, Victor," Maya said, her voice steady. "I've made my decision. I can't go back to the way things were. I don't want to." Victor's face fell, but he didn't look angry or defensive. He looked lost. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. I thought that if I gave you everything, all the things you wanted, it would be enough. But I was wrong. I see that now. I see that I've been so caught up in my world, my success, my empire, that I never really saw you. Not really." Maya swallowed hard, her emotions rising up like a tide. She had spent years feeling invisible, wondering if Victor ever truly cared about her beyond the image she represented. But standing here now, hearing the sincerity in his voice, she wondered if there was room for forgiveness. Was it possible to move past the years of silence, of distance, and find something real? Or was it too late? "I don't want things to be about stuff anymore," Victor continued, his eyes searching hers. "I know I can't change the past, but I'm here, Maya. I'm here because I want to change. I don't want you to be a part of my life just because of what I can give you. I want to love you the way you deserve. The way you've always deserved." Maya took a slow breath. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to see the man standing before her as the one she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who had made her laugh, who had promised to be by her side through thick and thin. But so much had changed. She had changed. And the person she was now, the woman who had learned to live for herself, wasn't sure if she could go back to the life they had once shared. "I don't know if we can fix this, Victor," Maya said softly. "I've learned that I need more than just luxury and gifts. I need someone who sees me, who understands what I need. And I don't think that's been you." Victor's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Maya saw the man who had once been confident in everything he did, now uncertain and vulnerable. The image of the man she had married, the man who had been so wrapped up in his own world, was beginning to fade. The man standing in front of her now was different, less sure of himself, less focused on what he could offer her in terms of wealth. But he still hadn't fully understood what she needed from him. "I know I failed you," he said quietly. "But I don't want to lose you. If you can't forgive me, if you can't give me a second chance, I'll understand. But I had to try. I had to let you know that I'm willing to change." Maya stood there, her heart a mix of confusion and clarity. She wasn't sure what the future held. Maybe she could forgive Victor. Maybe they could build something from the ruins of their past, or maybe it was time for her to walk away completely. The decision didn't come quickly or easily. It was a question she had to answer for herself and no one else. After a long silence, Maya nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Victor. But I'm not closing the door completely. I need time. I need space." Victor's face softened, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's all I can ask for." As he turned to leave, Maya stood still for a moment, watching him go. She had come a long way since the day she had left him. She had built a new life for herself, one that was rooted in independence and self-respect. And while she wasn't sure where her relationship with Victor would go from here, she knew one thing for certain. She would never again place her worth in the hands of someone else. She would never again settle for a life that wasn't hers to define. Maya walked back to the counter, her hands steady as she picked up the next order. The future was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of what it might bring. She had finally stepped into her own power, and whatever came next she would face it on her own terms.